Welcome to the CVA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and foreign policy. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In this week's episode, Justin Massie, full professor of political science at the Université du Québec in Montreal and co-director of the Network for Strategic Analysis, joins us to discuss Canada's NATO contributions, touching on the 2% threshold and whether or not we're quote-unquote free riders in NATO, the challenges and obstacles in meeting that target, our support of Ukraine, as well as the upcoming DPU and whether we can still even expect it, given that we didn't present a plan at the recent Vilnius summit. This is the Expert Series. Justin, thanks for joining me today for the program. Really appreciate it. The Vilnius summit was a few weeks ago, but in the aftermath, we're still discussing some of the outcomes and implications, particularly Canada's NATO contributions, as well as our support for Ukraine. So many of my questions will be in light of these developments. So let's get started. What do you believe are the implications of not meeting the 2% target, and what would be a reasonable approach for Canada to balance defense spending with other important priorities?
Well, I think the first implication is one of credibility, because if you're a government that signs a document such as in Vilnius saying that not only will you reach 2%, but that will become the bottom, the floor, instead of the ceiling, and you have no plan whatsoever to even think of achieving that target. Whether you appreciate, whether you like or not that target, there was still a commitment from the Canadian government to meet it. And I think not taking that commitment seriously or being hypocritical about it, saying, yeah, on one hand, we'll sign that document, but on the other hand, in private, we'll say we have no plans of doing so. And probably even if we were to inject more money in D&D, we won't be able to spend it. It signals, I think, to our allies that we don't necessarily abide by our signature, by our commitments abroad. I think that's the most important message. And the second message it sends, I think, is to Canadians that care about the Canadian military, that could join eventually the Canadian military, the Canadian forces. Usually in history, recruitment was much easier when there was a perception that the soldiers deployed abroad had the kit necessary to achieve their military objectives. That was the case in Afghanistan after a few years, because when the first ones that were sent weren't properly equipped to achieve the job. I had the same feeling when I met the Canadian military in Latvia. I had the pleasure of meeting some of them a few weeks ago. And my reaction there, my sense or perception of their job was that they didn't perceive of having the military equipment they needed to achieve their task. For instance, in terms of ammunition, you know that Canada's job in Latvia as a framework nation is to defend that country in case of future Russian aggression. I was told that Canada has enough munition to hold for 1 hour of fighting. That seems to me insufficient to achieve the task. That certainly does not help Canadians that would like to join or are part of the military and they want to perhaps stay in the military to do so, because they don't have the equipment to do their job. And so the message sometimes is about, oh, do we need to achieve 2%? I think it's beyond this. The implications are also about the capacity to recruit, our signals to our allies, and we're basically saying to everybody, both the Canadians and to foreigners, we are not taking this seriously. And that, I think, is a significant cost.
I recently had a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Zyla on the program, and he argued that Canada's contributions to NATO shouldn't be dismissed as freeloading or free riding, because we've actively participated in NATO operations and made substantial commitments to supporting Ukraine. And he emphasized this need for a balanced assessment of burden sharing within NATO and can consider input and output metrics and the broader context and complexities involved. His comments, as far as I can tell, were pretty polarizing. So I'll turn it to you. Should we contextualize Canada's contributions to NATO within this framework of our middle power status, limited resources and geopolitical considerations, rather than simply calling ourselves free riders based on defense spending benchmarks, or are we simply free riders?
Well, that debate has been about 7 years old now. And Ben is right, emphasizing that you need to look at both input and outputs. basically. So input is the money you spend on defense expenditures, and then the output is what you do with that money or with that kit. And so Canada is like the opposite to Greece. Greece has more than 3% of GDP or close to that invested, but it doesn't use its military because it wants to prepare for potential war against Turkey. And so it doesn't deploy to Afghanistan, has little to Ukraine, basically keeps its military at home. And so you may achieve that objective, but basically it does not help its NATO allies when they're in need. Canada is the opposite. We don't spend enough, but we're there in almost all missions. I say almost because we were one of the first two to withdraw from NATO operations in Afghanistan in 2010, following the Dutch then. But excluding that mission, that 2010 to 2014, Canada has taken part in all NATO operations in history, including right now in Latvia. And so when the Prime Minister says we have to look at what we're doing, not just how much we're investing, he's right. However, our capacity to achieve those missions is based on how much money you put in the military in the first place. And so you can be there, but if you can't achieve your objective, which is to raise up to more than 2,000 troops in Latvia because you don't have enough soldiers, or you can't deploy your frigates because you don't have enough sailors, or when you can't you don't have any air defenses or no drones or no counter-drone capacities, you can't achieve your job, which is to defend that country against Russian aggression. So there are, all the literature has demonstrated that there are clear correlation between how much you invest and how much you can deploy, your level of readiness or deployability of your troops. And so we can't use this dichotomically, but we do need to look at it in terms of nuance or more in the gray zone, if you will. But if we look at Canada's support to Ukraine, for instance, we can say, well, see, we're the, I think, sixth largest contributor in absolute numbers, but the 20th per GDP. And so which metric do you want to use? When you look at what the Ukrainian military are actually needing to achieve, which is Canada's objective, which is for Ukraine to defeat the Russian military in its country and have the Russian military retreat back home. When you look at the most important kit that we deployed, that we provided to Ukraine, say tanks, well, our 8 tanks are fewer than what Spain has done, what Sweden has done, what Slovenia has done, what the Dutch have done, what the Czechia has done, what Poland has done. Is that enough? Do we need 15 tanks in Latvia, or should they better be used in Ukraine right now? I'm in the camp that they should be they'd be of better use in Ukraine right now, and there should be a plan to acquire more in the coming years to replace those that would be provided to Ukraine. Because if we're going to fight to defend Latvia, it's going to be against the same enemy as those tanks would be now facing in Ukraine. And if we look at artillery, it's the same. The 4 that Canada has provided are fewer than many countries. It's fewer than what Portugal has given, what Australia has given, what the Dutch, the Danes, the Estonians, the Norwegians, the Italians, the Polish, all of these countries have provided. And so when our prime minister or foreign minister or defense minister go abroad and say, we're there to support Ukraine as long as it's necessary, and we want to defeat the Russian military, but you only provide that little kit to achieve that counter-offensive that needs it today, not in 2 years, not in 3 years. They need it right now to come across the Russian fortifications. I think that there's a disconnect between what we do and what we say we want to achieve.
So I would like to move ahead onto Canada's support of Ukraine in a moment, but before I do that, I want to linger on the 2% piece just for a moment. So talking about how Canada is not meeting its 2% obligations, and of course, we're not the only NATO country not to, but I'm wondering if you might be able to touch on some of the specific challenges, obstacles, or reasons behind why Canada hasn't achieved this target.
Well, first of all, because we don't want to, and second of all, because we can't. So because we don't want to is because very few governments, or prime ministers, I should say, they are the ones that ultimately decide, actually have an individual preference in defense policy. that they actually care about this issue. It's usually something that's imposed by external constraints. It's rarely something that is really among the preferences of the prime minister. We could see this with Jean Chrétien. We could see this with Justin Trudeau. Some others, like Paul Martin, had a different understanding of what was necessary, but there were rarely few. So they need to be convinced. And also, the military needs to convince cabinet members, and they're very reluctant to spend on military, given the fact that our federal government prefers to invest in provincial jurisdictions issues. And so there's little political will, so we need to face external constraints to invest. These can take two forms. First of all, from our allies, so when there's huge pressure from the United States, and we can remember what was happening during the Trump administration, during the NATO summits then, the pressure on Canada was significant. And one of the reasons why Canada decided to increase its military commitments in Eastern Europe was to prove to the United States that we were doing something and we need to invest more in NATO. And the second constraint would be the political cost at home. Usually, governments will spend more when the opposition parties are pressuring or mobilizing dissent against the government stance. Unfortunately, we don't see this right now in Canada. We don't see a Conservative Party pushing for Canada to invest more in military. They're saying so very timidly, but they're not making it a salient or important issue in Canadian politics. So if you're in a government that has no political preferences into investing this, you don't face significant political cost when you're meeting allies in Vilnius, for instance. You sign a document despite knowing absolutely clearly that you have no intention of meeting that target, and there's no domestic cost to it. Well, that to me explains the status quo and the inertia and the fact that there's no plan actually to achieve the 2%.
Canada's role in training Ukrainian forces has been appreciated, but when it comes to material aid, particularly in terms of heavy weapons, our support's been a bit more limited. So should Canada reconsider its position and provide more substantial military support, including advanced weaponry, to bolster Ukraine's ability to defend territorial sovereignty?
Absolutely. I believe in the objective of defeating Russia's aggression of Ukraine, because that will send a clear signal that there's no way in the 21st century that you can redraw borders by military force. I think that argument needs to be made clearly to Russia, and the best way to defeat its military is to impose significant costs on its invasion. The only way you can do that is to provide heavy artillery. So we usually use the numbers, so we will provide 500 million or a billion or something, but what actually matters is not the amount, it's the equipment that's being bought with this money and whether it's in usage by the Ukrainian military. If you look at the air defense systems that Canada announced in January, it's still not being delivered. So it has no utility in the war right now. The tanks have been deployed, the 4 howitzers have been deployed, but there are very few. And I wonder, what utility do we need tanks if it's not to face a Russian aggression? Is it because we want to deploy it in Haiti or elsewhere in the world? I doubt it, because we've sent 15 in Latvia with the clear purpose to defend that country against Russia. So to me, a priority should be about sending all that we can to Ukraine right now to invest in a fast-track acquisitions process, new equipment, more advanced, and take the opportunity of modernizing the CAF's military equipment by giving them what we have and buying new ones. But of course, we're slow to this. Other countries such as Poland are months, if not years ahead of us in their commands and in their orders. And we know the industry is limited in its capacity to produce. But even on other issues, such as munition, we know that there's shortage of munition. That's why the United States decided to give cluster munitions to Ukraine. Well, Canada does produce munitions in its country. It could serve our economic interest to ramp up the production. I have not seen any orders signed by the government to increase Canada's production of ammunition. To me, it would be a very easy sell to the Canadian public to increase such a production, and it would necessarily benefit our allies and Ukraine, knowing full well that there's a shortage within the CAF, but also in US and European militaries. And what we see in Europe, in the UK and the US are those multi-year orders being signed with the industry because they need to have that previsibility, that stability to increase, hire more workers and you know, augment the plant's production line, etc. They need that previsibility, that multi-year commitment. And I have not seen that from Ottawa, which does not, to me, make sense because, again, it's in contradiction with our political objective, which is to see the Russian military defeated in Ukraine. So it would make, to me, so much sense that we'd send as much as we can, afford to, and fast-track new acquisitions right now. And this is what I was hoping to see in the defense policy update, which has not been released, and which may not be released if there's no consensus in cabinet about the need to invest significantly more in the Canadian military. And what I sense is the reason why it's been delayed now with so-called consultation and whatnot is because there's no such political consensus in the Liberal government. The only way it can be imposed is when you have a prime minister that really cares about it and pushes that agenda forward. I've not seen that from Justin Trudeau.
I was hoping to push you on that a bit more, actually. So you're right. And I was just talking to Dave Perry and a few other experts as well, who kind of said, well, if the DPU was not released ahead of the NATO summit, which would have been an optimal time, can we even expect it at all? So I'm wondering if you might be able to dive in a bit deeper on that.
Oh, absolutely. So if we had DPU, if cabinet had approved a budget to augment Canada's defense expenditures, I'm confident that the prime minister would have wanted to showcase this to its allies, say, look, we have a plan. We're going to invest X amount of money, and you know, we did get all the applause and the praise by our allies. The fact that we did not do this means that we don't have such a plan of increasing investments. The sense I'm getting is that it's actually, it would be detrimental to our political capital to publicize the plan. And so it's better not to have a plan than have a plan that would be criticized by our allies and by opposition parties. So there's no other reason, I think, to explain such a delay. Even the consultation that were done this spring, to me, were not planned. And certainly, I think, were organized only to delay the publication of that document. So it may become like the feminist foreign policy, which took years to be published because there was no consensus on what it consisted in. And this is just, to me, problematic because there was a clear window of opportunity to adopt such a document. Other governments have done it. The Australians have done it. The British have done it. The French have done it, but not Canada. I don't understand why we are so slow compared to other countries. But there was that opportunity. There's the current war. There's the desire by a majority of Canadians to invest more in the military. There's no political cost of investing more because opposition parties won't criticize you so much. And there's a window because we have a government that does not necessarily care about deficits. Other future governments will care about deficits. And where they will be cutting is not healthcare or education or other social programs, but usually defense expenditures. And so the greater you can invest now and not have that tendency to always push forward in 10 or 15 years the major investments in the military, the more you invest now, I think the more assured you are of getting that equipment. Unfortunately, the second problem that I mentioned briefly before is the D&D and is just incapable of spending that money because our procurement acquisition process is too politicized and too constrained by other interests and objectives than simply providing the Canadian military the necessary equipment to achieve our foreign policy objectives.
Well, Justin, great having you on today, and thanks for providing such excellent insight and analysis. Before we close out the interview, I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts about anything we've discussed, or if there's anything pertaining to this conversation that you'd like to touch on that maybe we haven't.
One thing I was hoping with the DPU was to emphasize what are our most important region of interest, because it's quite bizarre to me that we have a Indo-Pacific strategy without a foreign policy strategy or policy statement, that we have a regional policy towards NATO now by default, not by design, but not a defense policy. And what I would have hoped with the DPU would to emphasize the importance of defending Canada at home first and then abroad. But by having no, for instance, a policy on defending Canada, whether through NORAD or through just in the Arctic in general, we have to assume that other regions are taking priority, or that our Arctic policy is basically the NORAD modernization and not more, which means no submarine, for instance, which are obviously not part of the NORAD modernization as announced a few months ago. So the lack of those regional policies and lack of overarching defense policy just shows, I think, that Canada does not have a strategy. It basically has policies that are adapted to political circumstances for domestic political consumption.
Well, Justin, thanks once again for joining me. Appreciate having you on, and hope you enjoy your weekend, and also hope to have you on the podcast in the future. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.